Welcome to episode 7. This episode focuses on a stage that many students look forward to and then quickly discover it's very different from what they expected. Collecting data in the real world. One pattern that still surprises me is how often students believe that once the proposal is approved, the difficult thinking is largely over. In reality, a very different type of challenge begins. This is the moment where carefully constructed plans encounter real people, real organisations, and real-world unpredictability. And this episode is really about learning how to work effectively within that environment. Before we begin, let's briefly look back. This slide reminds us where we've come from. In episode 6, we explored the lost middle. Many students discover that progress is not linear. Now the focus shifts from planning research to conducting it. I think this is an important transition because planning often happens in controlled environments. Data collection rarely does. And that naturally brings us to where you are in the journey. This slide captures an exciting moment. The proposal has been approved, the methodology has been selected, ethics approval may have been obtained. Research is no longer an idea, it becomes an activity. I quite like that distinction because this is often where doctoral students begin to feel that their research is becoming real. But reality also introduces complexity, which brings us to our first myth. This slide addresses something almost everybody experiences. Many students imagine data collection as a straightforward process. Reality is usually far messier. Research plans rarely survive unchanged. I've lost count of the number of times students have arrived with beautifully constructed timelines only to discover that real life has different ideas. That is not failure, that is research, and it leads directly to our next slide. This slide introduces several situations that are far more common than students realise. Participants become unavailable. Organisations withdraw support. Gatekeepers change jobs. Technology fails. Schedules slip. I've seen every one of these situations multiple times over the years. One thing I wish more students understood is that disruption is not unusual. It is often part of the process. And one factor sits behind many of these challenges: access. I think this is one of the most important slides in this episode. Many doctoral projects succeed or fail because of access. Always have contingency plans. I remember one candidate who spent almost a year negotiating organisational access. Then, 2 weeks before data collection, organisational priorities changed. The entire strategy had to be revised. That sounds alarming, but it also teaches an important lesson. Research often rewards adaptability, and adaptability becomes easier when we remember another important reality. We're working with people. This slide contains something I strongly believe in. Participants are not simply sources of data. They have pressures, priorities, concerns, motivations, limitations. One thing that still surprises me is how quickly students can unintentionally begin viewing participants as components within a research design. They are not. Research remains a fundamentally human activity, and that naturally connects us to ethics. This slide contains a message I've become increasingly passionate about. Ethics is not paperwork. It is trust, confidentiality, respect, transparency, responsibility. I've supervised many excellent researchers over the years. The strongest ones often saw ethics as a mindset rather than a process, because ethical thinking improves research quality, and ethical thinking becomes especially important when conducting interviews. This slide captures something that students often discover quickly. Interviews rarely follow the script perfectly. Unexpected topics emerge. Good interviewing requires listening as much as questioning. I remember one student who became anxious every time an interview moved away from their prepared questions. Eventually, they realized something important. Sometimes the most valuable insights emerge from the unexpected. And another data collection method brings its own challenges: surveys. This slide addresses a very common assumption. Many students overestimate response rates. Persistence, follow-up, timing, communication all matter enormously. I've lost count of the number of times students expected a 50% response rate and received something much lower. That is not unusual. It simply means survey research requires persistence, and case studies create another set of realities altogether. This slide perfectly captures organizational life. Organizations are dynamic environments. People leave, policies change, projects evolve, documents disappear. I've conducted research in several countries over many years, and one thing remains remarkably consistent. Organizations do not stop changing simply because a researcher arrives. Research, therefore, has to adapt to organizational reality rather than expect organizations to adapt to research. This leads us to another important lesson. Things will go wrong. I think this may be my favorite slide in this episode. Almost every doctoral researcher experiences setbacks. Adaptation is a research skill. One pattern that still surprises me is how quickly students interpret setbacks as evidence of failure. Usually they're evidence that real-world research has begun. The question is rarely whether setbacks will occur. The question is how you respond when they do. And that response often has a strong emotional component. This slide captures something almost everybody experiences: frustration, anxiety, impatience, uncertainty. These experiences are normal. I've become less certain that smooth research projects even exist. I've become more certain that emotional responses are part of research itself. That is perfectly normal, and it also helps explain what successful researchers tend to do differently. This slide introduces 4 excellent habits: remain flexible, document decisions, communicate with supervisors, revise plans when necessary. One thing I wish more students understood is that adaptability is not a weakness, it's a doctoral skill. The ability to revise plans intelligently often distinguishes experienced researchers from inexperienced ones. And perhaps that is why the reflection questions matter so much. This slide asks 4 excellent questions. What assumptions have I made about access? What could realistically go wrong? What is my contingency plan? How flexible am I prepared to be? I would encourage you to revisit these regularly, because many doctoral difficulties become easier to manage when they're anticipated early. And speaking of moving forward, let's briefly look ahead. This slide introduces episode 8, Making Sense of Data, from information to insight. One pattern that still surprises me is how often students think data collection is the difficult part. Analysis introduces a completely different challenge. Episode 8 explores that next stage. But before we finish, let's briefly acknowledge the references. This slide introduces several excellent authors whose work has helped researchers for many years. If there's one idea I would like you to remember from this episode, it's this. Real-world research is rarely neat. It is adaptive. The better you become at adapting, the more comfortable you will become as a researcher. And perhaps that is one of the most valuable skills a doctorate ultimately develops. I look forward to seeing you in episode 8.